Okay, so welcome to today's webinar. This is a series which has been continuing with a monthly webinar since August of last year, and there's been a fantastic experience for the More Clear Com team to cover a wide variety of subjects in and around data protection, privacy, and cybersecurity. For the most part, we focus on subjects that apply to every type of organization, but every so often we need to focus on a particular sector or type of organization that has a very specific type of threat and risk associated with it. And that's why today we're going to focus on the education sector and to consider why that sector and why the profession is so prevalent and high risk for cyber attacks and data breaches, and potentially what we can suggest and help you with in terms of A, reducing the risk of things going wrong, and B, how to manage this kind of thing effectively when the inevitable does happen. Hopefully it won't. And we'll give you some great case studies and examples all the way through. And if you feel that you have a burning question that you'd like us to cover then and there because you think there's something that's really relevant to something we're talking about, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A. However, every question that comes in today, myself or members of the panel will review and will provide feedback on those questions when we send out the slide deck. So we've got a lot to cover today, so I'll push on. I'll just give you an understanding of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to focus on the threat landscape, as we would call it, to the education sector and what that looks like in 2024. We'll think about why this is happening to schools and why it's happening to all types of education establishment, from primary schools all the way up to higher education and universities. Seasonality is a big thing in education and cyber attacks. We see seasonal trends, which are really important to make you aware of. And then we'll talk about awareness and why that's the essential first step, not just for education, but for all sectors in relation to cybersecurity, and understanding something is the essential first step to then being able to know what to do and how to deal with it. We'll cover a couple of very recent case studies, which I think will be really interesting to look at. And then briefly, I'll introduce a service that at ClearCom we feel might help the sector. And then you can contact us if you're interested in finding out more about that. I'm absolutely delighted today. I'm really pleased to be joined by two fantastic guest panelists. We've got Claire Moore, who's the head of compliance with the Independent Schools Bursars Association, which will add a really new dynamic in terms of normally there's a ClearCom team maybe with a guest, but this is the first time we've had someone from the sector that we're actually talking about, and that hopefully that will add a really different dimension, which is great. And then I'm joined by Paris Shah from within the More ClearCom team. Paris is now a veteran of these webinars and might be the third or fourth, I think, Paris. So always adds some fantastic insights, plain English, so that it makes sense and puts a great context and spin on things. So would you both be able to just briefly give us an introduction to who you are and what you do? Claire, would you like to start?
Yes, hello. Thanks, Richard, and thanks for having me on today.
Pleasure.
I was initially a solicitor, and then I worked in independent sector, in independent school, as an assistant bursar with responsibility for compliance for 11 years before joining the ISBA in April this year.
Lovely.
And I'm head of compliance there, so answering queries from schools on lots of things, including sometimes cyber related.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say, so the compliance is a very broad subject, I imagine, for you.
Yes, it is. It's very much broader than just sort of IT and cyber issues,
Yeah.
But that certainly has its part.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Rich. So hi, everyone. I too also come from a law background, not having reached the solicitor stage like you, Claire. I've also worked with schools in the past as on the teaching side, primarily around sports, so I understand the perspective from the teacher's end to some level. And I also look after our cybersecurity assurance services in More ClearCom and do our cyber essentials assessments as well. So in terms of clients, we have a lot of the schools that we manage or we advise. We do a lot of cybersecurity reviews as well. So I can give a good insight into some of the common issues that we find and then common solutions as well that the schools adopt.
Thanks, Paris. And I think those insights into why schools come to us and the kind of wide range of the challenges they face, I think will be really invaluable today. So thank you both. And if you've got any questions at any point that you feel you'd just like to pose by email, or you'd like to contact us about anything we say today that you'd like to delve into deeper, please just reach out to me at the email address on screen, richard.jackson@moreclear.com, and I'll get back to you very quickly. But we need to push on because we've got a lot to cover. So let's look at the threat landscape as it is currently. Very recent data from UKGov and the National Cybersecurity Centre. And what this report found towards the end of last year is that now every type of education institution, is more likely to identify breaches or attacks than the average UK business. And that's a trend we've been approaching that trend for the last 2 or 3 years, but we've now got to the point where every single type of school or college is more likely to be a target for cyber criminals than a commercial business, which is quite an astounding stat, really. Primary schools are the least likely within the sector itself, but still more likely than a business. And that's the first time we've seen that. And then you can see as you go through the scales and the tiers, if you like, within the education system, secondary is more than primary, further education is more than secondary, higher education is higher again. And if you look at the likelihood of an attack on a higher education institution or university at 85% likelihood compared to a business, that's an incredible disparity. I mean, Paris, sort of just your view on this in terms of
definitely. I think
what we're looking at.
The issue is that the core objective of educational institutions are not profit and business, so it's more around the teaching, it's around the safeguarding of children, and delivering the education piece. So cybersecurity would not be at the top of their priority, unfortunately. And it's what educational institutions don't realize is that should a breach occur, that would potentially disrupt their teaching services. So it's a fine balance. I mean, we'll speak about accessibility and defending cybersecurity threats. So there's a fine balance, and again, it comes down to that core objective. Businesses will have the budget, will have the resources to put controls in place to defend against cyber threats, whereas schools, education institutions won't.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the two things that kind of stand out to me is that from secondary schools up, they are more likely, this is factual, they're more likely to be attacked than not this year or any year going forward. And the second is obviously that growth throughout the sector up to from primary to higher education. From a cyber criminal's perspective, is that based on the fact that they would see that as providing greater yield for them? They get more for their efforts? Is that what's going on there?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, there's a lot more personal information that they'll have access to, that essentially would be used to sell on. And in terms of disruption as well, so you could have several threat actors. It's not necessarily a cyber criminal. It could be hacktivists, due to a cause, so that they're just looking to disrupt things. So because a lot of further education and higher education institutions hold higher standing within this, within the community, so that's probably the more likely threat actor, whereas businesses are more targeted by cyber criminals. I'm not saying that education sector is not, it's probably more opportunistic than specifically targeted by cyber.
Yeah. Before we move on, I think, is it true to say that higher education and universities are likely to be working on research and IP that might be attractive to nation state threat actors as well? Is that possible?
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, a lot of more prominent universities do work on a lot of projects, especially including working with the government sector on these things. So that can be likely a target for advanced persistent threat actors as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Paris. Yeah, so I think this is a really important slide and definitely one to take away. In terms of what's commonly targeted, deliberately targeted in schools, colleges and universities, everything on the left-hand side of the screen is potentially at risk. I mean, sometimes, again, I'll sort of ask Paris to elaborate more, but Some of this will be deliberately targeted, but some of it will be collateral damage, I guess. Would it, Paris, in terms of it just happens to be caught up in the attack?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, most attacks are opportunistic, you know. So we'll talk about some of the common threats in a second. So it's where they've found an open door into your systems or into some of your data, and that's where they've traversed and come across other data. So you know, I get this very often from clients saying, well, we don't hold any personal data or sensitive data on this system, but it's what the attacker can reach from that point onwards, should they breach. So, you know, should an attacker have access to a student's personal data, health data, you know, safeguarding data, that's quite a major point. You know, and then the question of it, well, what would they do with that? I think the repercussions are on the school rather than more so what the attacker will do with that. You know, they might not do anything. They might just retrieve the data and encrypt your systems and ask for ransom. But at that point, there has been a breach. Data has been exfiltrated, you know, so the consequences are for the school, the parents, and the children, you know, the students, not more so on the other end.
I think this is where good or best practice data protection and privacy and housekeeping is so important, because it's about considering the impact of what you're holding, and even if you might not think it's been deliberately sought out. It's one of the case studies will highlight this later on in today's webinar, about the kind of personal data and sensitive data that was impacted there, that maybe the school wasn't even aware it's still held, for instance. So yeah, so thank you, Paris, that's really interesting. And would you be able to, I think the next couple of slides, just talk us through this? So these are the kinds of things that might be hitting schools and colleges on a regular basis, I think, aren't they?
Yeah, so these are based on the NCSE's survey from last year. So these are the most common threats that school, or attacks that schools experience. So phishing and social engineering, which is probably the easiest method of attack, because it doesn't require any advanced knowledge. There's a lot of services on the dark web, you know, that you can buy essentially for phishing and social engineering. So any would-be cyber criminal can purchase this and really get on with it quite quickly. We conduct a couple of social engineering simulations, and it's so easy. I think we've had a webinar on this as well, as a human firewall. It's so easy to convince a person, especially within schools, because generally people are more trustworthy, I think. So if you approach a teacher in a trustworthy manner, or an administrator asking for help, they're very likely to give you that help, you know, and you can protect against this so much with technical controls, you know, you have your email filtering, etc. But there's always ways of getting around that, including multi-factor authentication, which we get around quite consistently in our simulations. Another area is viruses, spyware, and malware. So again, you know, if students have access to the internet, teachers, staff, there's always a risk that malware can be installed or downloaded from potentially malicious websites that they might not be aware of, you know, and these pieces of software are there to either, you know, carry out malicious actions such as mining, so that will be cryptocurrency mining and using your resources, and then also collecting data as well, it can be. And then denial of service attacks, this is more around the activist threat actor that I mentioned earlier. So they're potentially looking to disrupt your systems, you know, deface or disrupt users from going to your website, and generally just cause a little bit more difficulty in getting that information or having access to information internally or externally.
Yeah, and I think some of these will become quite relevant when we talk about the seasonality, won't they, in terms of what the stuff going on, for instance, during a Christmas close down period, and no one's aware it's going on.
Yeah, and another area is unauthorized access, and this can be internal and external. So identity and access management is quite a key piece for a lot of schools. And, you know, how do you manage the internal identity, the privileges of users? How do you assign them? How do you, you know, revoke them? So that's a very key area. So, you know, if you've not assigned the adequate privileges for internal staff, they may have access to information which they might not be privy to, you know, and potentially external contractors, you know, even external users where you're having meetings and things with them. So that's a very high risk and can be addressed by good governance.
Yeah.
So yeah, the other areas, ransomware. So again, goes back to malware and software. It doesn't have to have happened from malware and software. It can occur from several attack paths. So it can be from unauthorized access. It could be internal threat actors, you know. So it's really where there's a foothold an attacker will gain into your systems, whether it be on the cloud or on premises, and they would encrypt data, asking for a ransomware, usually in the form of some cryptocurrency, and they wouldn't decrypt it unless you paid that. So there are some controls, you know. You'd say, Paris, how do you protect against that once it's done? So we'll talk about that a little bit later as well.
Yeah. Okay.
As to how you can protect against that. And then lastly, business email compromise. And this list is not exhaustive. You know, there's a lot of other types of attacks, but these are the most common that I tend to see as well, and the NCSC have reported. So business email compromise is where an attacker will have gained access to a member of staff's email, and they would usually, I'll just give you a scenario. They would usually just look out for any patterns, and finance, HR, these areas are probably more targeted, and they'll look out for your general processes. So I think there was an instance, not in a school, but where, you know, invoice payment details on an invoice was changed for a vendor. That was sent to the vendor and it was paid out, and essentially that was paid into the cyber attacker's account rather than the actual the business. And another scenario is where payment details for payslips for staff were changed. If there's not a process in place to verify this, they were changed, and the staff only realized this 3 months down the line to say, oh no, where's my monthly salary? And it's actually been changed due to business email compromise. So it's very hard to detect if you've not got the correct controls in place and all the correct verification processes for finance or HR.
Yeah, and it's worth saying. So all of these areas and subjects have been covered in recent and previous webinars, and when we send out the slides, we'll include a link to the Moore Kingston Smith YouTube channel, because everything will be, all of these subjects are covered in more detail. Quite recently, we talked about business email compromise, and the latest data in terms of the financial cost of this to the UK is quite astounding. And although it might sound odd that someone within a finance team might willingly change bank details on the basis of a phone request or an email request, it is happening every day, and people are doing it. They're more likely to agree to it at certain times of the day or certain times of the week when maybe their diligence drops off a little bit, perhaps 3:30, 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. That's essentially social engineering. It's cyber criminals understanding when we're at our lowest ebb and when we're likely to do stuff. But generally, we're very trusting, and we tend to do things every so often that we shouldn't do, which I think is just a good basic summary, isn't it, Paris? That's when it comes down to it.
Absolutely. And then we've seen that time and time again when we've done, you know, pen testing engagements or, you know, red team engagements, where the social engineering is usually our preferred method of entry. And you know, the most prominent recent attack was on the MGM in Las Vegas, where it was essentially a social engineering call to the front desk asking to change the password, and it was granted. So, and you'd imagine someone like the MGM has invested heavily on cybersecurity, but again, you know, please go back and have a look at that human firewall webinar. I think it's very important.
Yes, I'll include a specific link to that one. So why schools? And I know that that we'll get some great contributions from Claire on once we get into the sort of specifics of education. I've often referred to education and cybercrime as a bit of a perfect storm, which is defined as a critical or disastrous situation created by a powerful concurrence of factors, which I absolutely love as a definition. essentially what we've got is, with the schools and education sector, is large, vast volumes of personal data to start with. So this data will be either sensitive or financial. It's extensive. For the most part, inadequate security provisions, and that's a broad statement, but it could be down to technical controls or the IT. It could be cybersecurity awareness, training and awareness for staff, which is always so important. And as we've mentioned previously, the highly lucrative reward for cyber criminals when they do have carry out a successful attack on a school or a group of schools, as it might be with for instance, with a multi-academy trust. So these three factors together, layered, make education a very attractive target for malicious threat actors and cyber criminals. And if you look at the hard data, I won't go through this with great granularity, but we're talking about 32,000 schools roughly in the UK, and that equates to currently approaching 11 million students. So that's 11 million data subjects essentially. So the schools are processing their data on a daily basis, a constant basis, and bearing in mind these are just current students. There's also the likelihood and potential that previous student data might be stored and processed still as well for different reasons, maybe some justified and some not. And again, when we get to one of the case studies, this will be highlighted. And in a recent Cantium survey of 500 head teachers, school IT professionals and teaching staff, you can see some stats there which on the face of it look quite negative. However, Claire, I'd be really interested in your view on the opposite sort of perspective of this, and maybe what from the school perspective, what might be going on here, and maybe there's some positives in this as well.
Yes, I think so, Richard. I'm turning the first stat around a bit. I mean, that means that 63% do rank it as a high priority. And I think that's really positive, and also probably represents a movement in the right direction from maybe where sector was a few years ago. I think the stats probably also belie quite a wide variation between schools in how far they are along with their cybersecurity. And some won't yet really understand what they need to do, and therefore obviously they won't be doing it. And others might be developing or even have finished developing a strategy, but they might not be fully implementing it yet. Perhaps that might be due to budgetary or I think quite likely time constraints, and sometimes nervousness about how staff might react to changes that impact their sort of day-to-day working habits. And then a few schools actually do have quite a clear strategy, do understand where they need to be, and they have the resources and they're ready to implement it. And some are beginning to embed those processes, I think, in a bit in the same way that, you know, the health and safety, the preventative maintenance things there are quite embedded and quite well monitored within schools. And I think some schools are putting cyber in that same category, moving in that direction. What I don't think that these stats represent, I don't get the sense that there's a complacency as such. I think it is perhaps not all schools being aware that, as you said earlier, you know, a cyber incident is probably a case of when rather than if.
Yeah.
And I think also it can be a bit overwhelming. I think schools could look at the things that are reported in the press, look at the sort of apparent inevitability and the sophistication of some of these attacks and feel slightly powerless in the face of them, which is where it's really helpful to have the kind of tips of what to focus on first, you know, what changes you can make that will have the biggest impact. And also just within schools, there are, like all organisations, there are so many competing priorities, and perhaps, you know, more immediate day-to-day issues or physical safety and security might feel more critical, even though a cyber incident can, as I think you're probably going to go on to explain, can have quite a significant impact on a school's operations.
Yeah, that's some brilliant points there. And Paris, if we sort of take that from a different dynamic, if as a society we accept that inevitability that Claire's sort of mentioned there, does that change things slightly in terms of, yes, it's important to put the right defenses in place, but maybe it raises our game or our focus on what to do when it happens? I'm thinking kind of this sort of scenario where if you live somewhere and your house is in an area that regularly gets flooded, I guess in the end you accept you're going to get flooded, but you just get better at defending your property and you get better at recovering quickly from that. Is that maybe how things are changing?
I think that's a really good analogy, because it's, you know, you could do so much, invest heavily in tools and, you know, controls, staff, resources, etc. But, you know, an attack methods are constantly evolving. So
Yeah,
it's almost a cat and mouse game. So where you're chasing new attack methods, not much changes in the cyber world if you think of it. It's just how the sophistication of attacks. So as our defenses get stronger, the attacks get more and more you know, sophisticated. So it's almost a race against both. So you should always prepare for the what if and when. You know, it's essential as part of a wider risk management framework. So you've got your governance controls, and then you should also look at your, you know, incident management and response, really, and that fits into your general business continuity strategy as well. So, you know, what is essential, I think, I don't know if we'll talk about risk appetite as well, but it's what is essential to your business, and to the institution. So, you know, if should a cyber attack happen, so what? You know, you need to determine what risk that presents, and what controls you need to either avoid it, mitigate them, or transfer that risk in some way or another. So again, that buy-in has to happen on a larger scale, rather than just the IT team, for example. So it has to be owned by the whole organization, rather than just a single team to say, you know, here you go, IT team, can you please make us secure? Unfortunately, it can't work that way.
Yeah, that's a great point to take away from today's session. I think in terms of that ownership, who does the responsibility belong to? We've talked a lot in previous webinars about culture, and I think it's a culture of privacy, a culture of security. I think once you start to develop that, and that's why we talked previously about the human firewall, and Paris mentioned that phrase. Again, I hopefully you'll be able to follow up after today's session and kind of look at that in more depth. So if we if we pause for a moment and just consider that UK schools are responsible for the data of 15.85% of the total population, and many are potentially unnecessarily and unlawfully storing, processing the data of former pupils or staff going back many years as well. This is a really difficult question. I know Claire's probably thinking the same thing, but so what action is needed by or on behalf of schools, which is a really important thing to add here, to help them focus on cyber risk and put adequate measures in place? And I'm conscious here as well, we're talking potentially about two sectors within the profession, aren't we, Claire? There's that maybe have different resources and different routes to resources to help them.
Yes, I think so. I mean, it is a really big question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think guidance, really clear guidance, is helpful. The DFE does put things out. The National Cybersecurity Centres, I think, is a really useful resource for schools to look and check what they're doing against that.
Yeah.
I think, you know, webinars from people like you is really helpful to give tips and direction. But I think a lot of the obstacles probably are kind of from within school almost, and I think probably, I know that you're going to talk about that a bit later, but
yeah, I mean, in terms of I mean, relatively, I guess it is still a very new subject for schools or any profession to be worrying about. I know we do a lot of work with charities and non-profits, and we work a lot in the social care sector as well, and it's almost like it's one more thing to worry about, one more thing to think about in terms of compliance. But Paris mentioned something earlier about, oh no, sorry, Claire, it was you who mentioned about the other overheads that are accepted as you know, health and safety, or that are just accepted as part and parcel of running a school. And I think on a previous webinar, I mentioned that cybersecurity and data privacy are now almost like a fixed cost. And I think that's the key point for me, is once every type of organization associates this subject as something they should form part of the bigger picture, rather than just a nice to have. Is that your experience, Paris, that we're kind of getting there a bit with that?
Yeah, definitely. So I just wanted to go back to the question, actually, if that's okay. Yeah. So
of course,
so I think the most important step is really to look at that risk management piece, as to, you know, what is your appetite, what are the risks to your school. Many different schools will have a different risk approach, you know. So that's essential to determine. So where your maturity is against cyber risk. So as Claire mentioned, you've got the NCSC, you've got several frameworks that you can align with. The Department for Education has some guidance. The RPA risk protection arrangement, if that's correct.
Yeah.
I can't remember. I can never remember that. So the RPA has some standards to align with, and that's a requirement to align with their insurance needs. So there's a couple of frameworks that schools can adopt to determine where the maturity is in the current time against it, and then develop a strategy to improve that maturity, essentially.
Yeah.
And as a part of that, you will determine which threats and risks are prevalent against the organization.
Yeah.
So,
I guess
Rich,
we all make
let's
decisions.
go back to your
No, it's fine. I mean,
second
I think we in every walk of life, we make decisions consciously or subconsciously every single day where we are weighing up proportionality of risk and risk appetite. When we walk out the door in the mornings, where this, we've talked in previous webinars about heuristic or conscious thinking or critical thinking. This is all part of the same subject, really. It's what's the worst that can happen? Are we prepared to risk it or not? And like you said, it's subjective and different to every organization in terms of what the risk they're prepared to tolerate.
Yeah. And for a lot of state schools now, it's a requirement to consider it. So whether they approach that in a checkbox exercise manner or genuinely, promote a cultural change, that's again, it's up to them. Sure. And similarly in for independent schools, there may be a different way of approaching the resource budget area, but it's again, do they see it as important or not? So
yeah, Claire, I'd be interested in your view on the independent schools market in terms of what would the impact be in terms of about brand or reputation, and if how would it perceive that to impact a school
if there was a cyber incident?
Yeah.
It really depends on what the extent of it is, what the effect of it is on the children's education, how parents feel about it. I think there's such a wide variety, isn't there, in how the impact of these attacks are. Some of them can be relatively minor and sort of more in the inconvenient category and get sorted relatively quickly, whereas others can be quite crippling and actually take down a school's operations for days, or make it very difficult for them to operate day to day. And I think there are some schools that have felt they needed to close completely. They just can't carry on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think one of those will be covered in one of the case studies. So seasonality patterns is something that I observed a couple of years ago, especially in the States, where there was a real surge in cyber attacks on schools and school districts, as they would be referred to in the States, particularly in the summer close down period, very much so in the final days before a school closes, or in the first few days when they go back into a new school year. And Claire will know better than I do the kind of pressures that exist in those different time periods, but that's very deliberate because they're focusing on a time when staff are under more pressure, which then affects their diligence and their focus. They've got far more plates to spin. They're dealing with new students, parents, etc., all the other pressures that might come with that. There may be impacts on resources and staffing, especially in the summer periods and the Christmas periods in particular. And I know Claire might have some views on some contributions on that, about how maybe the staffing levels are drastically reduced or non-existent over Christmas periods. And then, as Paris was talking through some of the attack methods earlier on, school might come back in January and suddenly discover that all this has happened over the holidays.
I think that's right. I think actually quiet periods and busy periods both present risks in different ways. I mean, Christmas and New Year, I think particularly, is a time when a lot of schools really do almost completely shut down their operations and have really very few staff working even remotely. And I think the problem with that is that problems accessing your systems or documents in your system or so on that might flag that something's going on, they might not be spotted for quite some days. And that gives cyber attackers quite a lot of time to nosy around your systems and get what they want. also, I think even if you've got quite a good monitoring system for trying to pick these things up, or something that technical that's in place that will flag alerts and so on, if all your staff are on holiday and really switching off over Christmas and New Year, who's picking up those alerts and who's going to action them? And will senior staff be around to sort of get involved and help out with a response? I mean, most schools do have that as part of their critical incident planning, but I think it can be very difficult at those times of year when it's a real family time and everyone is really trying to switch off a bit.
Yeah, I'll ask Paris for his thoughts, but this reminds me of, before I sort of invite him in, there was a stat from the US on cyber attacks that took place over Christmas periods or Thanksgiving weekends, for instance, or periods, where when the IT professional was called in from annual leave or from a family event to deal with it, they were in 75% of instances were inebriated at the point they started to try and deal with the attack. So there's also that human reality factor to consider here, where you not only have you got IT staff on call, but are you making sure that they're fit to perform when they are called in?
Yeah. That's yeah, I mean I'm sure there's been many instances of that over Christmas periods. But Claire, that's a really fair point, Claire, in terms of, you can have all the capability in terms of, notifications and alerts and such, but it's really what you do around them. And I've seen time and time again where, the latest, even in larger law firms and professional services organizations, where they've invested heavily in equipment to alert them as to incidents, and nothing happens of it, even if they are on site. So if an incident does occur, or something is flagged, it's called an instance of compromise or indicator of compromise. Who knows, if you've not got the adequate resources, if they're managing other areas of IT, they might still miss it. So this adds to that risk still, where they're not away.
Yeah. Does this factor into, sorry, Paris, does this factor into business continuity plans and the fact that so many are not tested at any stage to see if they will work in the event?
Absolutely that. So it's all well and good to have a policy sitting there, or operating procedure, but if you're not testing it regularly, you don't know how effective it would be in the instance of a real world attack. And that goes down even on the level of a simulated ransomware attack. What would you do? You might say, well, we rely on a third party Cyber Essentials certified service provider externally, and they're qualified to do it, but still that needs to be tested. And what we tend to see a lot is third-party service providers don't always apply the cybersecurity controls that they would apply internally. It is seen as a best practice, but IT operations and cybersecurity are still two very separate areas, unfortunately, because they should live together. It should be part of the process, but it doesn't, not always.
No.
Yeah, I think that's interesting as well, where practice doesn't necessarily follow policy. So you might have a policy, for example, around backups, and we have seen this happen, and whether that's being done in-house or whether it's being managed externally by a provider. It says in the policy or in the provider contract that backups will be done on a particular schedule and so on. But are you checking to make sure, first of all, that they are being done, but also have you actually tried to restore from a backup ever to make sure that it works? Because there have been situations where schools have gone, it's okay, we've got this, we've got backups in place, and yeah, the backup process has run, but it hasn't actually left you with a usable replica of your data. So it's not as useful as you thought it was going to be. Yeah,
that's a really good point, Claire. And again, we've seen that where backups have gone corrupted. So when an incident has occurred, they've looked to backup, and essentially the data is not there, or it's not adequate as to how far back they need that data for the recovery time. But another area where seasonality comes in is also where systems are updated. So schools tend not to update systems day to day or weekly. Generally, our advice is to update these every 14 days, or even sooner if you can. But because of the issues in terms of accessibility, students need to have access to those systems every day including teachers, they won't apply those updates, those critical security updates, which are leaving many vulnerabilities, and they will do that usually in half-term time, and that's set to auto update. And still, if you've not got a vulnerability management system or something to measure that process, then potentially that also fits into, attackers will know when your update schedules are. Generally, schools will do that through half terms and summer holidays at the beginning of those periods, really.
That's such an important observation. Yeah, they'll know this, won't they?
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So yeah, I should have put this up a few minutes ago. Sorry. But yeah, so that essentially these are the kind of fun, and this is actually one of the prime reasons why we wanted to time today's webinar at the end of June rather than going into late July or early September, because I think the timing it's a really good time to just raise this subject in the sort of last 4 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks before the schools finish for the summer holidays. So yeah, so they're key periods. A couple of questions. I think to be honest, we've probably covered these. This sometimes happens in the webinars. The conversation is so good that that we cover this. Claire, I think you've already kind of commented that about the leadership teams comprehending the statistical likelihood. I think that's something we've addressed really. And I think probably we've covered the technical barriers, have we, Paris, as well, pretty much?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of resources, core objectives of the school, and that also fits into the leadership teams.
Yeah. I think there are cultural barriers potentially as well, and challenges. I mean, and also I think time is a really big one. Having the time both to do the training, to upskill the right people so they know what needs to be put in place, and then to train staff. Time at inset can be very tightly fought over, and it's difficult when you've got so many things that you need to get into those insets around safeguarding and health and safety and data protection more widely, to have that focus on cyber. But I think the message is little and often. You don't need to block out half a day to train everybody on cyber and then not do it again for a year. It's probably much more effective to just keep dropping things into your weekly staff meeting, for example, so that it's constantly on people's minds what they need to do to help protect.
Completely agree. Yeah, and that's and as you know, that's how you develop culture and behavior, isn't it? I think that's the one probably common misconception with data protection and cybersecurity, that it's something that it's a box you need to tick with some annual training or an annual conversation. But as you know, Paris knows better than anybody, cyber criminals don't work that way. It's constant. Yeah. So yeah, for certainty. So we mentioned earlier about awareness, and hopefully today is helping with that. Great quote here from Nathaniel Brandon: the first step towards change is awareness, and the second step is acceptance. And I think that's kind of where we're at with the subject of cybersecurity per se at the moment, is that we're into that phase of acceptance, I think, where the majority of organizations probably do accept this is now part and parcel of doing business or operating in the modern world. But without the awareness, we're kind of oblivious for the need to change. And not every organization needs to change, but we're always looking to need to improve. And without acceptance, we can't implement that lasting transformation. So Paris and I were talking about this a couple of days ago. I think step 3, Paris, action can only come after the first 2, but that's when we can start to make real gains, isn't it, I think?
Yeah, definitely. I think, as we spoke about earlier as well, once you've established where you stand, then you can develop a defined action plan and see where, create a roadmap essentially of improvement and change. So again, that's understanding the implications, implementing the adequate technical controls, and then also looking at the wider governance, non-technical control area as well, which Claire's mentioned. Training is one of the key areas where, I think we're all guilty. After you've done the annual training, who remembers it at month 3? We don't. The general advice is to have that slow drip feed of data that goes out, constantly. So
yeah, I think the one thing that I think hopefully, and I do see this happening more and more, is that collaboration and sharing of awareness within a lot of sectors. And I think that one key role probably that schools or colleges or universities can help within their own sector is to share their experiences when they have been through this kind of thing, and in terms of what were the kind of triggers and the signs that first brought it to their attention that something might be going on, and then also how they dealt with it, what they felt they did well, maybe things they did less well and could learn from. And I think that sharing of awareness and maybe even sharing of resources would make a real impact, I think, on the sector.
Something Claire mentioned earlier, I think in previous conversation, where teachers and educational staff don't tend to like change. Even moving from school to school, they might see different systems and processes being used, and that's quite a difficult change for them, because almost they already have so many things to do. So if staff are aware of these risks, then it will become a priority for them, and it will become second nature to recognize social engineering attacks or issues, potentially even be issues with students where a student might raise something to them and they can identify that there's something wrong there and report it in the correct channels. But if they don't have that awareness, like you said, Rich, then it's and it has to become almost a second thought, and staff should be encouraged to report things, and rather than being reprimanded about constantly reporting things, I think that safe culture should also be there. So where staff might be a little bit hesitant to report things to IT, because IT tend to complain about how many tickets they get, or I don't know. So it's again, it's that cultural change. General, it's everybody's responsibility.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. So very much an area for. We're fine for time. We're not too bad. So key areas of focus for schools and education as it stands today. Claire will recognise all of these challenges and probably more, or definitely more. So we've kind of covered it in some perspective, but I think one question I think would be really great to look at, Claire, is who needs to ultimately own this. I know that Paris is correct. It's a collaborative joint responsibility for every organisation, but who might you see as the persona within the school setting that would potentially drive it and own it to a higher level, do you think?
I think that's a difficult one, and obviously practice will vary between schools, and schools vary very much in terms of, some will have quite a big IT team with a lot of expertise and experience, and others won't have an IT team at all. So it does depend, but it does often fall to the bursar or the sort of the support staff to actually oversee the implementation and the development of the strategy, even if they're not doing that themselves. But it does, as you talked earlier about, not inconveniencing teaching staff to detract from their main focus of teaching. It does need the buy-in, especially where there are going to be changes of the head, the senior leadership team, and the governors as well, because it is frustrating for teaching staff. They just want to get on and teach their lesson, and if they have to go through the two-factor auth process in order to get onto their teaching resources to start doing what they're there to do, that is frustrating. So it is about sort of training, but making sure that everyone understands why they have to do it, and making it as easy as possible, and implementing those changes at a time when staff have got time to get their heads around it, so that they're not desperately scrambling to work it out on the spot.
Yeah, I think one thing that was recognised, excuse me, with COVID-19 and the pandemic was that COVID acted as almost an accelerant to cybercrime. I think it took us to a place that maybe we might not have reached until sort of 2026, 2027. And I think, is that something that affected schools, do you think, particularly in terms of the way that they were forced to support students and the way that students were asked to work? And maybe we've got this impact of AI now as well in terms, so are all of these things kind of adding pressure, do you think, to schools from a technical perspective?
Do you mean in terms of COVID, meaning that everybody suddenly was connecting to school systems remotely, often via their own devices, and that those practices have continued?
Yes, I think, yeah. So the legacy of COVID is we've continued with that, not completely, but there's that model of, it's understood as an acceptable sort of practice that was kind of forced upon us, I guess, but now it's day to day.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think there is an element of catch up on that to make sure that you've got everything well connected, and things that were put in place very quickly and maybe out of the box during COVID, without the usual lengthy lead time and thought process and risk assessment that would go around it. Yes, I think maybe there were things that then might not have been done as they would have been done in the usual course of business, that can cause problems later, or that, I think
sure.
that's right.
I've certainly seen schools shift to using other tools and, you know, remote working tools. So that's definitely the case, I think, in a lot from that spurred on from COVID, obviously, and that presents in itself a whole other risk area in terms of working remotely, because that environment is not protected within the educational institution's boundary. So, you know, we can't dictate what users are doing at home in terms of security. So how do you protect against those risks? You know, there's and it's a combination of both, again, of non-technical and technical controls. So, you know, training awareness, and then also where you can, and if you have the resource to put those. And again, you wouldn't have done that in the impulse of COVID, you know, in terms of putting those controls in place. So and a lot of that has remained. That legacy is still there in terms of the risks that, because remote working, I think a lot of teachers still do work remotely, you know, planning lessons, accessing systems outside of school hours, because they can now. So have you looked, you know, have educational institutions looked at that now as an extension to their risk management process?
Yeah, it definitely was almost a proof of concept, wasn't it? That suddenly we were forced to do something, and actually it kind of worked. But with that came, as Claire mentioned, without the usual checks and balances for most organizations, putting certain things in place. So so just sort of moving on, we'll just briefly stop and just review a couple of recent case studies. So this was an attack on 14 schools. They weren't part of a multi-academy trust, but they were, I believe, using the same systems and suppliers in terms of how they were operationally working in terms of the technology, etc. So they were all impacted by an attack in 2022, and then because there was a collective decision not to pay the ransom demands, the data was leaked online early in 2023. And this is the attack that I mentioned earlier and referred to in terms of old personal data that was impacted by the attack. That the school, one of the schools, was holding passport scans and so passport details, and I think also parents from previous school or ski trips going back about 11 years. So it's just a good example of while this isn't relevant to stopping the attack happening, it's about that ripple effect and the impact of that attack, and the scale of the impact didn't need to be quite as significant as it was, because that's the sort of data that potentially didn't need to be held. So that's very much a data protection subject area. And if you're on today's webinar and you're concerned about what you should or shouldn't be storing legally or ethically, please reach out to me, and I'll put you in touch with one of our data protection team who can give you some good advice and support on that. But you can see very sensitive stuff. Claire, I mean, this would be your worst nightmare, wouldn't it? This sort of data being released.
Yes, I think so. But there is a difference, you know, in the categories there, because, you know, yes, I think probably most schools would agree that passport scans that you're using for a school trip, you don't need to keep really beyond the length of the trip, and that should be deleted, and that might be a housekeeping issue. But things like SEN information, you are actually required to keep that for quite a long time. And there is a lot in between where there is a balancing act.
Yes.
Of, you know, yes, you don't want to keep it because you don't want it to sit there with the potential to be compromised in an attack, but equally you don't want to be without it if some issue crops up down the line and you don't have the relevant paperwork or documents that relate to it. So it's a difficult one, that, for schools. But having a retention policy that you're happy with and your governors are happy with is a good start.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it was back to 2011. So I think you're absolutely right, and there is that sort of balance between the information and the data that you absolutely must retain and for sort of fixed amount of periods, and how do you keep that ring fenced and secure in the event, and then sort of limiting the impact that, looking at the way to, the core question is, do we really need it, and why have we got it? And then if you sort of carry that sort of mentality throughout, that helps you to develop that privacy culture. This is more recent. This was and this, I know this is a well-reported case, and Claire and I have had some great debates in relation to this one, in terms of decisions that were made by the school and what drove that decision, and whether that was a legal requirement or whether it was just something an interpretation. So if anyone's got any questions about this one, we're more than happy to debate, and it certainly made me question my previous view on whether the right decisions were made, or the validity of it, if you like. So school was attacked in May of last year. It coincided with half term, so definitely that sort of deliberate seasonality impact, I think, was going on there. The school made the decision to close based on the fact that they were unable to access their single central record. And I'll ask Paris to comment on the backing up comment at the bottom there in terms of cold copies, and so that he can explain what that actually is. The school's interpretation was that because they couldn't access the single central record, they were legally obliged to close. Now, this is a state school, so it wasn't in the sector, an independent sector with borders, etc. My interpretation now, after sort of speaking to Claire, is that it probably isn't a fixed legal requirement, but I think it could easily be interpreted that was the right thing to do, and they probably reached that decision because they didn't have those other factors, Claire, wasn't it, in terms of the borders and the fact that the school was open and closed for a finite period of time each day.
Yeah,
So
I think it probably just, in every case, the school will be looking at what they need to be operational, and obviously that school decided that they couldn't continue because they couldn't access their single central. And I'm not sure that would be the case for all schools, where the single central will be replicating data that is held elsewhere, which they do still have access to. It might even be held on hard copy staff files, for example. But I think it does highlight the need for schools to think about what data is really critical to their day-to-day operations. What if it went offline, what couldn't you carry on tomorrow if you didn't have? And I think certainly things like pupil emergency contact details and pupil medical details, pupil medical conditions, and some of that sort of information would be really critical. And I think you would struggle to sort of carry on if your MIS system was completely down and you couldn't access that sort of information. So I think it's really worth schools, as part of their critical incident planning, making sure that they've got the data that they really need, either sort of ring fenced in another system or in hard copy.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, Paris, I'm conscious of time. Could you explain cold copies in about 15 seconds? That would be great.
Yeah, not a problem. So the Department of Education gives good guidance on this. So essentially, their guidance is around having at least 3 copies, and 2 of those should be in separate devices and 1 offline. So offline is ring fenced, so it means it's not connected to the internet, or it can be, but for only a small period, so that you can transfer those backups. That can be either on-site or off-site, and that includes data on the cloud services. So if you are using a MIS system that's hosted on the cloud, for the likes of Arbor, iSAMS, etc., they will have their own backup strategies, which you should confirm that align with this as well.
Brilliant. Yeah, if you just sort of talk us through this section of the guidance, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, so another area, as we spoke about, unauthorized access. So accounts should be protected, using adequate password policies, using multi-factor authentication. Schools might use MFA, teachers might push back with MFA, but there are also other ways of applying. Multi-factor authentication doesn't just mean your phone or your SMS. It means a other factor. It could be, fingerprint, could be actual presence within a location. And then business continuity and disaster recovery. Claire's already mentioned this in your critical incident planning as well. So what you must identify what the critical areas of the business are that could affect or the organization that could affect the general day-to-day running, and potentially what do you do if a disaster occur or an incident on the cyber side.
Brilliant. Thanks,
So,
Paris. But
yeah.
so I think what the takeaway from this is that there's some fantastic guidance from the Department for Education that will give really specific support to schools, and we can provide links to that if you haven't got access to that already, and obviously all of today's slides as well. I'll very briefly mention EdSecure. So it's a new service that we've launched at More Clear Comms specifically for the schools and education sector. It provides that blended privacy and security focus that I've mentioned and Paris has mentioned in terms of it, it's a hybrid type activity and subject now really, and it's all about designed to reduce your risk and to mitigate breaches or attacks. And if you're interested in finding out more about EdSecure, maybe that's something that would work for your school, we would be delighted to speak to you about that and hopefully help you to reduce your risk. Unfortunately, we've run over slightly, so won't be able to answer any questions live now, but what we will do is respond to the questions that have come in the feedback that goes out and with the slide deck, and you'll have our contact details there as well. So if you've got any questions, we'd be absolutely delighted to try and answer them for you. Thank you again to Claire and Paris. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you both on today's session, and Claire, your insights have definitely put such a different spin in terms of our perception as consultants in this area to make sure that we can provide the best advice and guidance to schools, and to make sure that we understand the kind of challenges and perspectives that might be held within the school sector in terms of what we're dealing with, so that we can really help them moving forward. So thank you. That's so much appreciated. And Paris, as always, great insights. And you can tap into our team if you're on today's webinar. Please reach out to us and tap into us whenever you want. So today's was the final webinar for a couple of months. We're next on the 26th of September. Again, we're going to be looking at a specific sector, which is the legal sector, with tipping the scales, looking at cyber guidance for law firms. So again, I think we have a generic audience that more than welcome to join that. It's open to everybody. Thank you for attending. Thank you again to our guest panel, and thank you, Claire, and thanks, Paris. We'll see you again soon. Take care. Have a great day.
Thanks. Take care. Bye bye.